Hey guys, welcome to my video on stencil cutting. If you have not watched my video on intro to screen printing and stencils, please watch that video first. This video is for the people who want to do things without a computer, so you don't want to use Photoshop or any computer software programs, or you don't have them. This is what you're going to be doing. So stencils are a pretty well-known art technique. It's been around for a very long time. I think some of the earliest stencils are in caves like 35,000 years ago, and the first stencil that they've ever seen was a human hand with colored powder blown over the hand, so the image of the hand showed up on the cave walls. In recorded history, some say that was the Chinese who first started using paper stencils. So it's obviously a very old technique, but it's still used today, so that's telling you guys something. So it's a good technique to have in your repertoire. You can use anything for a stencil, really. You can use cardstock, you can use paper, you can use transparency paper so you can see where you're placing your stencil. You can use foam core or cardboard. Tape is also a really good stencil. It takes away the need for a bridge and an island, which I'll explain later. So I'm not going to give you guys a step-by-step on how to create a hand-cut stencil, because really at the end of the day, it's going to depend, your technique's going to depend on what kind of material you're using, what kind of application you're using, so whether it's spray paint, airbrushing, or simply a brush with paint on it and you're brushing over the stencil. And it's also going to depend on what kind of knife you have. So I'm just going to give you guys some tips and techniques that I've used throughout my career in graphic arts and in art in general. So check it out. Okay, when you guys start cutting your stencils, a couple things that you need to be aware of is make sure you're using a sharp knife. So you can get an X-Acto knife like this at any craft store like Michael's, or even the dollar store might even sell knives like this. You can also use a box cutter if you want. They're just a little bit clunkier than an X-Acto knife. These X-Acto knives can have replacement blades, so there is like a little knurled grip on this X-Acto knife which you can loosen, and then you could take the blade out and you can put in a sharp blade afterwards. So make sure you're using a very sharp blade when you're doing your hand cutting stencils, and be careful obviously. The angled part of this knife is the actual cutting edge, so that's the edge that you want to be putting a lot of pressure on, because that's what's actually going to be doing the cutting. Don't hold your X-Acto knife like a pencil, because inherently you're going to want to start cutting at an angle, so you don't really hold this knife like a pencil. Another thing you have to be aware of is the surface that you're cutting your hand cut stencils on. I'm going to use this rubber cutting mat right here. I can cut this mat all day long and it doesn't really damage it, and it doesn't damage the table underneath it. A cheap alternative is cardboard, so you can cut your stencils on top of cardboard as well. Just be aware though, when you cut through cardboard, it does leave marks, and over time all those little cuts will create little ridges and little divots in your stencil, so you don't want to use cardboard too much. When you're doing your cutting, when you're cutting your stencils, you can either use the negative space as your stencil. So here I have the negative space where my square is, so I can spray my application into this square here onto my artwork surface, and it would create a little square. Or you can use the positive space that you cut away, and then you would spray your application around the square, so like spray paint your airbrush, and when you take away this positive space on your artwork, there'll be a negative space where your square was. So really you can use the positive or the negative space for your stencil. So what's the best material to use? Really, at the end of the day, it depends on what kind of application you're using. If you're going to be using anything with water-based ink or paints, those soak into your material very easily, and it can kind of deteriorate your material over time. So if you're going to be doing something with like water-based inks or paints, paper is not necessarily the best stencil material to use, because it soaks up that water and it could end up causing leaks or blurred edges around your artwork. Cardboard's really good for that kind of stuff, because yes, it does soak up the ink, but it still holds its structural integrity. Con of using cardboard, it's obviously harder to cut through. I personally think the best stencil material is cardstock, because it's still easy to cut through, but it's still very sturdy. Even after it's soaked up a lot of paint or ink, it will still hold its structural integrity. Tape is a great stencil material to use because, like I said earlier in the video, you don't have to worry about bridges. and obviously if you stick this onto your artwork, it's gonna stay in place, so you're not gonna worry about accidentally spraying onto your stencil and then your stencil moving. That's not gonna be an issue with tape. In this case, masking tape like this is the best stuff that you wanna use. And the last thing it also depends on is the surface that you're spraying on. So if you're doing your artwork on paper, tape might not be the best, because when you put the tape onto the paper and you try to peel the tape off, paper might rip. So it all depends on your material you're spray painting or you're painting onto. It depends on your application that you're using to paint. So you guys have to do a little bit of experimenting. When you guys start cutting your stencil, it helps to determine what is the positive or what is the negative image here. So I have this black ink that's on this paper here. So all the black that's on this paper, that is gonna be the image that's gonna be spray painted onto my artwork. So in this case, this black here is what I would wanna cut away from the stencil, so I can create that hole, so I can actually spray the paint through that hole to create this exact image onto my artwork. In contrast, the negative space here, so all the white that's in this negative space, that is what I would want to be on my paper. So that white would be the ink that would be spray paint onto my artwork, and in the positive image, this black is the image that I would want to spray paint onto my artwork. So I'm going to show you guys how some tips and some techniques when you guys are cutting your stencils. I'm going to use a stencil cutting practice sheet to show you some of the techniques that I use. So when I'm cutting, I don't hold my knife like a pencil. I like to hold the knife straight up and down like so, and then at a slight angle going towards the edge. So again, that angled part of the blade, that is the cutting edge of your blade. So you want to be putting most of your pressure on that edge right there. Another pointer that I can give you guys is when you guys are cutting your stencils, try not to lift the knife. So here I just did a straight cut here. Now I've gotten to the corner of my square. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rotate the paper and I'm gonna continue cutting. The reason why you wanna do this is because you want to make sure that all your cut lines are connected. If you happen to make a cut and you have to lift your knife up like so, make sure that the knife is reconnecting to the cut line that you had previously made here. So what I mean here is I've already cut this. I want to make sure that my cut line is going to line up with my knife. This is what happens if you don't line up your cut. Alright, and you make a cut like that, and then now I still have that little corner that's still connected because I did not connect my knife with that cut there. And if I rip that away, well, that didn't turn out too bad, but I did still rip my paper like so. So a very helpful technique is try not to lift your knife up. Instead, what you should do is you should rotate your paper as you make your cuts. I'm going a little bit off my stencil here because I'm kind of rushing, but that's okay. So, and the positive image gets cut away quite easily. That technique is really helpful for stencils that have a lot of straight edges, kind of like this star here, but when you get to a very unique shape like this guy here who's doing a cartwheel, chances are you're gonna have to lift your knife. But if you have to lift your knife, try to make sure that your connections or your cut lines are still connected. So don't start your cut anywhere else. Keep continuing on with that cut line so that you can guarantee that your lines are gonna be all nice and cut. The last thing I want to talk to you guys about is bridges. So bridges are basically a connection to the rest of your stencil to make sure that you're not accidentally cutting away your negative space that you want to keep there. So what I mean by this is In my positive image, I have this circle that I want to cut out, and then I want to keep this white area here, and then I want to cut out this black area. Well, if I were to do that, what would end up happening is I can cut away my circle, but then as soon as I start to try to cut away my square, obviously my circle stencil goes with it. So we have to create a bridge in order for this white to stay in place. So what that would end up looking like is kind of like this. These little gaps that I have here, I would consider that the bridge. So when I cut away this white area here, or sorry, when I cut away this black circle, and then I try to cut away these parts here, this white part will stay with my stencil. And I'm going to show you guys that right now. Alright, so you can see here that the white area, just like in this positive image, has stayed there because I have these bridges that keep this white part connected with my stencil. Now obviously when I spray paint over this, those little gaps are still going to be there, so it's easily fixable. You can either just, you know, paint that afterwards after you've actually sprayed your stencil, or you can do this all with tape. So you would have to make two separate stencils here. You would make one stencil with the square in the middle, and then you have to make the little stencil and a stencil circle in the middle afterwards. And here's an alternative I just kind of crudely made here. So with tape, you don't actually have to create those bridges because obviously they stay in that spot. So let's see what these stencils actually look like. There's a stencil there, and then if I use my paper stencil on a different piece, take that one away, you can see I get the same image, but I still have bridges there. So it really, at the end of the day, it kind of depends on what kind of image you're looking for. Alright, that's stencils, you guys. So I want to see you guys do your own stencils for your assignment. You're going to do your stencil cutting practice. This is paper, printed on paper. Practice cutting on paper. It's very easy. You can even use it as a stencil, but I mean, you can't use it very often because obviously this paper will start to kind of get wet and crumpled up. Your next assignment is you're going to design your own stencil, and then you're going to cut out that stencil. And then your last assignment is using that stencil, and you're going to use that stencil to create some artwork. Some tips, another tip that I can give you guys is use the negative space for sure, but also use the straight edges on your paper. So kind of like this here, right here, this edge that's on this paper, great stencil as well. So if you want to create cool effects where you spray along the edges to have a very straight line, also an effective way to create a stencil. So for those without a computer, you're doing your screen printing questions that I had mentioned before. In another video, your stencil cutting practice. And then your third assignment is designing your own stencil. And then your last assignment is using that stencil to create some artwork. Good luck.